Do you remember the time C.S. Lewis showed up as a character in a book by Arthur C. Clarke? Yes, the Arthur C. Clarke who wrote 2001: A Space Odyssey. Well, I'm about to tell you about it. This is Strangers and Aliens, pulp science fiction. Hey, I'm Ben Avery, and this is Strangers and Aliens. Strangers and Aliens is a podcast and a video feed about the nexus between fantasy and faith, science fiction and spirituality, creativity and Christianity, and how these things of the imagination engage our spirit and engage our mind. And today I want to talk about a book that I have that I found that connects the dots between two of the greatest imaginations that we've had in modern literature, and that's C.S. Lewis and Arthur C. Clarke. The book itself is called From Narnia to a Space Odyssey, The War of Ideas Between Arthur C. Clarke and C.S. Lewis. Those of you who have spent time with this channel know that I adore C.S. Lewis. He has engaged me since I want to say, in third grade, when my third grade teacher, Mrs. Jenkins, read to us The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And then not too long after that, I got the box set of the Narnia books. And he has written so many different things that just did so many different things for me and for really the world. There's, of course, the Chronicles of Narnia, a foundational piece of Christian fantasy and just fantasy in general. There's a space trilogy, which has one of my favorite books of all time, Perelandra. Side note, go to benavery.com/contest, sign up for some of our social media, and you'll get information about projects I'm working on, videos and stuff like that, and you could win one of 3 copies of the Space Trilogy Omnibus. benavery.com/contest. Contest is good through May 21st, 2023. If you're watching this in the future, I'm sorry. He's also written many theological works that still resound today, and he brought theology to the masses in a lot of ways with Mere Christianity and tons of other books. Arthur C. Clarke, on the other hand, is one of the giants of science fiction of all time. He wrote the book 2001: A Space Odyssey, 2010: Odyssey 2, 2061: Odyssey 3, 3001: The Final Odyssey. But he also wrote many, many more things. I mean, just dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of things. Which brings us to this book, From Narnia to a Space Odyssey, The War of Ideas Between Arthur C. Clarke and C.S. Lewis. And oh, what a war it is. We'll get into it. I try to be positive when I talk about books when I'm doing the Is It Worth Reading series, because I really do hope to use that series to introduce readers to something new that they would probably enjoy. If I'm going to talk about a book in a negative way when I'm talking about the question, is it worth reading? It's because even with a negative answer, an answer of no or an answer of yes, but as homework, I find that there's value in the conversation. And I do think that there is value in the conversation about this book, but I would probably go with the homework angle of things, because there's just a number of different problems that this book has. But first, let's start with the values. Value number 1, awareness. Now, there's only 17 pages of letters in this book, but what those 17 pages are is there are 17 pages of conversation between Arthur C. Clarke and C.S. Lewis, which that is pretty awesome. And part of that is opinions of each other's work, how they engage with each other's messages. It's really interesting and really neat, but it's only 17 pages. And so while I value the contemporary responses to the works that they are discussing, and I value the opinions of both of these men as far as their values about writing and story and science fiction, and to be honest, not just science fiction, but science progression and projection, as they're looking into the future and looking beyond the fiction side of science fiction, but looking into the science side of science fiction. There is a real value here in exploring those ideas, but it's only 17 pages of letters, and so the book does get padded out with a number of other things. Value number 2 is short stories. This is a short fiction collection. This is not meant to be a book of letters. It is a series of 17 letters that are there to set up some short fiction. Now, there are 2 C.S. Lewis short stories and 1 essay in here. And then there are 5 Arthur C. Clarke short stories and 2 essays in here. But the problem that kind of counteracts the value is that there are better collections out there of those stories. If this is the only book that you get because you want to get a sampling of C.S. Lewis and a sampling of Arthur C. Clarke, there's actually a lot of value in this book. But if you're looking to this for something new, you probably, on the C.S. Lewis side, already have it in The Dark Tower and other stories. And if you don't, well, get this, but you won't get The Dark Tower, and you won't get After 10 Years, but you will get the short stories that are in there. If you're looking for short stories by Arthur C. Clarke, and there are many other collections out there of Arthur C. Clarke's work, and probably there's multiple collections that include the 5 different stories that are in this book. So let's talk about the problems. And problem number 1 is the title, From Narnia to A Space Odyssey. Everything in this book really predates both Narnia and A Space Odyssey and doesn't really connect dots between Narnia to Space Odyssey, which when I first picked this book up, that's what I thought it was going to do. I found this book in the library a number of years ago and checked it out and did a cursory read through. I read the letters and I read a couple of the short stories by both of them from the book, returned the book, and decided, you know what, I want to do a deeper dive. And I think this would be a great book for my collection. And honestly, as someone who tends to lean toward the completionist side of things when I do make additions to my collections, it does work and it's a part of my collection and it did have value. Here's another value, just the rabbit trails it sent me on where I found other things that I wasn't expecting. But anyway, the title, I honestly thought there was going to be some sort of link between the correspondence between C.S. Lewis and Arthur C. Clarke that maybe inspired something from A Space Odyssey. That wasn't to be the case. Now, there is something else, but we'll talk about that in a minute. But anyway, the title, it was misleading. And problem number 2, the subtitle, misleading. The War of Ideas between Arthur C. Clarke and C.S. Lewis. And if by war you mean polite exchange of letters that express slight disagreement between 2 men who respect each other, then I guess, yes, you could call it a war of ideas. If you mean war of ideas because they don't agree on a couple different things, then yes, I guess you could call it a war of ideas. But it really isn't a war of ideas. Not at all. These are 2 men who respect each other and respect each other's work and who actually have a high opinion of each other and who have a high opinion of each other's work. To the point where Arthur C. Clarke, in some of the letters in this war, invites C.S. Lewis to come and express his opinion in a meeting of the Interplanetary Society. I think it was the Interplanetary Society. It's not a war of ideas, okay? There are disagreements and there are ideas that don't align with each other, but I wouldn't call it a war. Problem number 3, typos. There are a lot of typos in this book. I am a writer. I understand you make mistakes, but you also have people on your side who are editing and who are helping. And if you don't have that, you're at least doing it multiple times yourself to try and catch these things. But there's a number of them here. Problem number 5, the editor of the book is Ryder M. Miller. And I just feel like there's a condescending attitude towards C.S. Lewis from Ryder Miller. And he actually talks about how he was not familiar with C.S. Lewis before this, and it was difficult for him to get through C.S. Lewis's work as he was working on this. And I almost felt like this was homework for him. Like he found a good idea, but then realized I don't really like half of my idea I'm not a big fan of. And so there's that. And then the other thing is the Arthur C. Clarke profile comes from a completely different place. It comes from a place of adoration and a place of fandom. I want to give the benefit of the doubt. If I were to write a profile of C.S. Lewis for something like this, and the other person is someone that I wasn't familiar with, and when I became familiar with him, I wasn't a big fan of him, it would probably be difficult myself. But problem number 6, there's only 17 letters. I talked about it already. Now there is, I guess, technically 18 letters because there is something that Arthur C. Clarke wrote about C.S. Lewis to C.S. Lewis for this edition long after C.S. Lewis had passed away. But yeah, in all honesty, that was probably my biggest disappointment. I went into this expecting there to be more about the correspondence between them, and instead you get two separate introductions to the writers instead of one essay that kind of put it all together. And then you get these 17 letters, and then there's a full letter that C.S. Lewis wrote about one of Arthur C. Clarke's books that I found online. There will be a link in the description. I'll talk about it more in just a minute, but that could have been included in here. It would have given so much context to some of the things that they were saying as they were passing their messages back and forth. So is it worth reading? Sure. But if you're here for the letters, just know it's only 10% of the book. It may not be worth the price of admission for you. But those letters are worth reading for sure. If you're here for the war, it's not really much of a war, but that's just hyperbole. Don't worry about that part of it, okay? The letters do have some high value. If you're here for the short stories because the authors intrigue you and you want an introduction to that, like I said, there's other things you can pick up. There's The Dark Tower, there's Tales from the White Heart. These are both books that there will be links in the description below that allow you to go to Amazon, and does give a little kickback to me without changing the price to you. So there's that. But if you're here for the short fiction, then you should check out these other books probably. But again, I want to say I appreciated the rabbit trails it sent me on, and I want to talk a little bit about one of those rabbit trails that this book sent me on that was just delightful and might be interesting for you, and it might even be a rabbit trail you yourself would want to follow. There's a quote that gets talked about a lot in this book from Perelandra, and it's quoted in Miller's introduction to C.S. Lewis. It gets quoted in Arthur C. Clarke's letter to C.S. Lewis. And just to read a couple different things out of the letter from Arthur C. Clarke to C.S. Lewis from 1943, he says, "Dear Mr. Lewis, I wish to disagree somewhat violently with you over a passage on page 92 of Perelandra. Beginning, he was a man obsessed with the idea, and ending is to these minds a welcome corollary. The whole passage seems to be an outburst of unreasoning and emotional panic, rather surprising after the acute penetration of the Screwtape Letters, which incidentally appealed considerably to me, notwithstanding the fact that I have never felt much sympathy toward the Christian tradition. You, as well as Professor Weston, seem obsessed by an idea. Clearly you have encountered the juvenile and usually badly written outpourings of the pulp magazine science fiction writers, and have had sufficient discernment to realize that, trivial though they often are, they do represent a powerful new force in the world of ideas. But you have taken science fiction and its themes far too seriously, because stories of interplanetary imperialism and destruction are the stock in trade of the hack writer. You seem to imagine that there exists a considerable body of people looking forward with over-anticipation to vast wars of conquest over the surface of an expanding sphere centered upon the Earth. Nothing could be more remote from the truth." He then talks about the difference between a science fiction fan and members of like the interplanetary societies that were popular back then. And he takes issue with C.S. Lewis's idea that man is just going to bring their sinful nature with them to the stars. And in particular, he talks about the phrase, "the vast astronomical distances which are God's quarantine regulations," which is C.S. Lewis's sci-fi identification of the boundaries of our sinful nature on the rest of the universe. That Earth is quarantined because of our sinful nature. And so there's some back and forth about that. But from that letter in 1943, we go to a letter in 1953. And this is the one that caught my attention. And this is the one that I mentioned in my opening to this video. In this letter from February 1953, Arthur C. Clarke is disappointed that C.S. Lewis is not going to be able to come and speak to their Interplanetary Society thing. The final sentence in that letter reads, "I hope you won't mind the not uncomplimentary reference I make to you in my forthcoming novel, Prelude to Space." Now, that's what caught my attention. That's what got me interested. And that's what made me track down Prelude to Space. Now, this edition here is an edition that this might have even been the edition, not that C.S. Lewis held in his hands, but the edition that C.S. Lewis would have seen. This is a first printing of the book, but it's not really a book printing. It is done in the printing style of the Galaxy Science Fiction magazine. It was published by Galaxy Science Fiction as a pulp fiction book to be on the shelf with other magazines, but if I wanted to get another first edition, that's actually like the first hardcover edition, it's far, far, far more expensive, and I wasn't going to do that. But it was a lot of fun to get this book and actually hold in my hands a similar edition to what may have been the one that C.S. Lewis would have had a chance to read, to find out the not uncomplimentary reference to C.S. Lewis. Now, the book itself, I would say, homework. Okay. It's not fun to read. It's just a lot of technical details. The characters in the book, I feel stock, feel wooden. There are some personalities that rise to the top, and there are some times when Arthur C. Clarke's humor is allowed to shine through. That's one thing I was very surprised when I read Tales from the White Heart, was just to find out how funny Arthur C. Clarke really is. He's got a sharp wit. He's not just a hard science fiction writer. He's a hard science fiction writer who does have a grasp on humanity and does have a pretty sharp wit. And it does show through sometimes in here, especially like there's a scene at a dinner party before the launch of the rocket that was going to go into space. But yeah, so there's conversations between politicians and scientists and engineers, and it's just not all that interesting. But I still wanted to read it. Why? Because C.S. Lewis is in it. And so I wanted to see, did C.S. Lewis show up at the dinner party? Well, he didn't, and I was a little disappointed. The reference comes in the prologue to part 3, where there's talking about some of the pushback against the space program. It's talking about like the idea that once man goes to the moon, it could become a staging ground for an attack on the Earth. But it says, the second and perhaps more important body of opinion, while admitting that interplanetary travel was possible, opposed it on a mystical or religious grounds. The, quote, theological opposition, as it was usually termed, believed that man would be disobeying some divine edict if he ventured away from his world. In the phrase of Interplanetary's earliest and most brilliant critic, the Oxford theologian C.S. Lewis, astronomical distances were God's quarantine regulations. If man overcame them, he would be guilty almost of blasphemy. And that was it. But what does that mean? It does mean, in the world of this book, C.S. Lewis was quoted as a character in this book, which was kind of fun. And I am very curious what C.S. Lewis's own reaction to that was. I don't know. My research didn't bring anything up, but my research did bring something up that was very interesting to me and was even more delightful than C.S. Lewis as a character. And that is the book Childhood's End. In this book, as part of their correspondence, they talk about Childhood's End, and they talk about how Arthur C. Clarke was curious what C.S. Lewis thought. And I was also curious, what did C.S. Lewis think? So I find the book. I've had it on my shelf for a while. There's actually a couple different books that I bought at the same time. This is another one. They were at a library sale. They were never library books, but they were apparently donated to the library, and the library didn't need them. So there's 4 old books, old science fiction books that I bought, and I do sometimes buy science fiction books based on the cover, if they're cheap. Childhood's End is something I've always been curious about, so I decided I'm going to read it. And I did. And I really, really enjoyed it. I enjoyed Childhood's End even more than 2001 and 2010, which are books that I really do like and appreciate. If you don't like the movie 2001, which is movie homework for sure, if you're into science fiction, you should watch it at least once so that you can get an idea of what people are referencing. But the book itself is actually a little bit better. This was very fun, very interesting, about a kind of a first contact, what happens when a civilization that is far advanced from our own comes and presents themselves as mysterious benefactors, and then they find out there's actually a secret about them, that they've been here before, and, Anyway, really good book. I really enjoyed it. C.S. Lewis apparently liked it as well, and said so in a letter to Joy Davidman. Now, I found it in a website called apilgriminNarnia.com, and the letter is written in 1953. It's at the end of the year, so it's actually after Arthur C. Clarke mentions, hey, I hope you don't mind my not uncomplimentary reference to you in Prelude to Space. It says, Dear Joy, as far as I can remember, you were non-committal about Childhood's End. I suppose you were afraid that you might raise my expectations too high and lead to disappointment. If that was your aim, it has succeeded, for I came to it expecting nothing in particular and have been thoroughly bowled over. It is quite out of range of the common space and time writers, away up near Lindsay's Voyage to Arcturus and Wells's First Men on the Moon. It is better than any of Stapleton's. It hasn't got Ray Bradbury's delicacy, but then it has 10 times his emotional power and far more mythopia. And he goes on to talk about the book, and I was just so excited to find this because I had just read the book, and then I find the letter, and it's almost, not quite, but almost like having a little bit of a discussion with this man that I respect and admire about a book that we both enjoyed. Not quite, but almost, but not quite. So to sum it all up, homework. Value in both of these, but homework. However, if you really want to read those short stories, pick this up. It's a really interesting book, and it has some fragments from C.S. Lewis's writings that never were published, and they're first draft stuff. This is probably a far better bet for you. If you're interested in Arthur C. Clarke's writings, I do recommend Tales from the White Hart, but I really recommend Childhood's End. You can find links to all of those books in the description below. Remember, I do get a little bit of a kickback from Amazon if you do purchase anything after clicking on that link, which helps out the podcast and helps out the video feed. Also, you can find links to the contest live until May 21st. benavery.com/contest. Sign up, get entries. You could win one of 3 copies. It'll be great. And until next time, I want to say thank you so much for spending time with me, where I get to talk about my favorite author of all time and one of my other favorite authors. You probably can figure out which one I'm talking about. But until next time, thank you so much for spending time with me. Thank you so much for listening, watching, and wherever you go and however you're going, Godspeed.